Hi, I'm Tom Collins, the Executive Director of the Clean Elections Commission, and we're Arizona's voter education agency. And we're here today to talk with an expert on an issue that is going to be important to voters as you're going about evaluating candidates, looking at ballot measures, and casting your ballot in November. Here with me today is Professor Dennis Hoffman, Professor of Economics at Arizona State University and the Director of the Office of the University Economist. So thank you, Professor Hoffman, for being here.
Great to be here, Tom. Great to be here.
So the big issue in our political discourse right now when it comes to the economy is inflation.
Right.
Could we first kind of define inflation in a way that folks could really understand when an economist is trying to talk to a regular person about what inflation is? What are we talking about?
Well, there's several issues that we probably want to get into, and it's what is it? Why are people upset about it? And where did this particular inflation episode come from?
Yeah.
So what is inflation? Inflation is a general price level increase over time. It's not one or two goods. It's almost all goods, all services. It's not a single price increase. It's gradual or accelerated price increases over a period of time. That's an inflationary episode. What causes it? Too much money and too much credit chasing too few goods and services.
Okay. So too much money chasing too few goods and services.
Right.
So that's a concept. How that affects folks in their everyday lives is how do they see it? How do they feel it?
Well, that's the real challenge with the pain of inflation, is that it doesn't hit everybody equally. So let's do two examples.
Yeah.
And I do the first because it's closer to me, but there's a fair amount of me's out there. So if you have a fixed mortgage or own your own home outright, you've been gainfully employed throughout the last 5 years, but able to do a lot of your work remotely or on Zoom, so you're not commuting day to day.
Yeah.
Your employment's been steady. You've been getting raises because everybody's been getting raises. Inflation is an annoyance because when you go to the grocery store, things cost a little more, but your incomes are up, and you're not paying the big rent, you're not paying commuting costs, that kind of thing. So this is kind of the haves, higher income, or let's just say if you own your own home or on a fixed mortgage, this particular inflationary episode has not been all of that painful.
Yeah.
Now let's flip it.
Yeah.
Let's suppose I'm a commuter, a renter.
Yeah.
I'm living kind of paycheck to paycheck.
Yeah.
It's been a tough go.
Yeah.
I'm got a young family. I'd really like to buy a house, but the price of housing keeps going beyond my reach.
Yeah.
I can't get ahead, and inflation just seems to be a killer to me if I'm in that second group. So part of the problem, I think, that we've got to make sure we understand is inflation does not hit everybody equally.
Yeah. So I mean, it's interesting as we've seen in the surveys we've done of voters and the issues they care about. A broad base of voters across parties and demographics, though, are describing what they're concerned about as the effects of inflation or inflation. So that seems like a little bit of a disconnect in the sense that, broadly speaking, everybody is upset about inflation, but the impact is more narrow than that. What do you think might account for that?
Well, part of what accounts for it is how you're getting the information back from voters or from consumer surveys, that kind of thing. I've watched a lot of economic data. I've always followed things like the Michigan Consumer Confidence Survey and things like that. I've always been wedded to that. But I'm less enamored today from the feedback that I get from those particular surveys. Why?
Yeah.
Because they're so colored by the political lens. People are expressing their political sentiment through responses to surveys.
Yeah.
So my best example is in the spring of 1980, before the fall election between Carter and Reagan. Republicans, through the Michigan Consumer Survey, were asked to assess the economy. The economy had 16% inflation and like 12 or 13% unemployment.
Right.
Okay?
Yeah.
So they weren't particularly happy with the economy back then.
Yeah.
Okay? Republicans assessed this year about the state of the economy at historical low unemployment rates and declining inflation rates, but still moderately high, at least in our context.
Yeah.
Republicans in this era assessed the economy worse than Republicans thought it was back in the spring of 1980 when we had high inflation and high unemployment rates. And so to me, it wasn't a really an assessment of the economy. Right. It was their angst with the particular political landscape. Yeah. And they didn't like the incumbents in party, and so they said the economy's terrible.
Sure. So that I think is an interesting point. And part of the point of this series that we do is to try to bring out a little bit about the context for how voters are operating. And I think that's an important point. In this inflationary environment that we're now in,
yes.
When you were asked to describe, what the cause of our current inflationary environment is, as opposed to those people might have experienced in the past, is, how do you address that? And what
It's a great question. It's a great question, Tom. And so the 70s experience, mid to late 70s experience into the 80s experience with inflation, very different. Yeah. It was actually much higher back then than the current episode, but the causal agents were very, very different. Here's the way it begins. In 17, 18, and 19, worldwide, there was very little inflation. Yeah. Firms had very little pricing power. Yeah. There wasn't inflation to be found anywhere. Global supply chains worked very well. We did have some frictions globally with tariffs, but they didn't get passed through to consumers in the way that they might have because there was just no pricing power back then. So then we had the pandemic.
Yeah.
Pandemic changed everything. Complete disruption of supply chains. So you couldn't get goods from A to B. Certain countries just shut down, and shut down for more than a quarter like the U.S. did. They shut down for years. So product disruptions were really bad. So what happened in the United States and in many countries, governments ran to rescue. So they tried to stimulate their economies with expansionary monetary and fiscal policy. We had programs where we gave money to employers so that they wouldn't miss payrolls. So money and credit was abundant. Yeah. Spending was abundant to try to keep people employed, keep people alive in many sense, right? And what did we do? How did we respond? Well, we stayed home. We didn't travel. Yeah. We didn't go to entertainment. We didn't spend our money elsewhere. So we just stayed home and we had a bunch of money. Yeah. And we went on an Amazon frenzy. Yeah. We tried to order every good that was available. Yeah. And some wasn't available. Yeah. Remember the toilet tissue? That wasn't available. I mean, there was all sorts of things that wasn't available because of supply chains. Well, this unbridled appetite for goods with a limited supply of goods. Remember how inflation? Too much money chasing too few goods. And it hit us in 22. It hit us in 23. It hit every country, not just the United States. And it was virtually unstoppable. So then there's more to this story, obviously, with the Federal Reserve's reaction, and it's however you want to go with this.
Well, I think that's an important illustration, first of all, of the principle you're talking about. I think that now that we're here, we've talked about the fact the way folks may be looking at this may be more of an example of their political reflection as to necessarily what's happening that's affecting them daily life. We talked a little bit about how the pandemic, basically created that situation of where you have a lot of money, fewer goods. In fact, fewer goods than were anticipated being there. So now we're here, and sort of. One of the things that you hear talked about, just to give you an example of what voters are hearing, is politicians of different parties and in different levels of government talking about we need to bring prices down.
Right.
And when you hear that as an economist, you hear a politician talk about getting prices down, not just curbing inflation, that is to say the growth of prices, but bringing them down. What does that mean if a politician says that?
Well, it kind of depends, I guess, depending upon what good you're talking about.
Yeah.
But in general, we're going to be in good shape going forward is if we can slow inflation to the Fed's target at approximately 2%.
Yeah.
Now, is that going to take price levels back to 2019?
Right.
Nope, it is not for many goods.
Yeah.
But incomes are not going to go back to 2019 levels either. And incomes have gone up almost as fast. And frankly, over the last year, they're growing faster than the rate of inflation. So there's an opportunity to kind of glide into this like we did in the 80s following all this excess of the 70s. Prices didn't decline in the 80s, but they stopped going up. And we were able to kind of come back to normal levels. Now, gasoline is a good example, though. Gasoline prices could actually come back down to pre-pandemic levels. And as a matter of fact, it's a little bit of a puzzle to me right now as to why gasoline prices have remained as high in recent months as they have. The wholesale price of gas is, I saw it yesterday, is like $2.
Yeah.
The margin historically has been like 50 to 75 cents.
Right.
Maybe $1 on really a good day.
Right.
I'm seeing 350, 370. Where's that coming from?
Right. Well.
And it's because folks have pricing power now, and it's gonna, things are sticky.
Yeah.
Services are the latest inflationary environment, and that problem is pricing power came, workers got power on their own, said, I'm going to stay home if you don't pay me.
Yeah.
By the way, why did all of that happen? The pandemic again.
Right.
What happened in the pandemic? We fired everybody.
Right.
You had to separate from employment in order to get benefits. And then we had this mad scramble to try to bring people back. And that has created increases in wages and more supply disruptions.
So in a kind of sense, I mean, one of the things that I think happens with folks is that many people have moved past the pandemic. Again, I think that's true of our political discourse and the kind of conversation and the surveys. I mean, if you look at the surveys we're taking of voters, they don't indicate that COVID or any of those things are top of mind for voters any longer.
Right.
But that doesn't mean that its effects have dissipated from the system. It was a traumatic event economically as well as it was health-wise.
It was a traumatic event worldwide. I think that's a fundamental fact. You can just look up statistics globally. Yeah. It's very they're very available, and you can see that the U.S. experience with inflation mirrored almost every developed country around the planet.
So there's this question is sort of two parts, because we're in Arizona. Voters in Arizona are doing a unique thing, right? They're in a swing state for presidential election. They're in a swing state for control of the U.S. Senate. They're in swing state in terms of several districts here for control of the U.S. Congress, and the state legislature itself is poised to potentially go to either party, right? So a voter in a particular district in Arizona's vote may be impacting the control of every level of state and federal government. Now, in that context, first at the federal level, and I think at the state level too, what are the kinds of policies that impact, government policies that impact inflation, if any?
Oh, many, many policies impact inflation. And I think you've couched the question in the way folks, in my opinion, need to be assessing things. Instead of looking back at 2022 or 2019 or whatever, we've talked a lot about history now. Yeah. Let's go forward and say, what policies from what party, if my biggest concern is about inflation, what policies from what party are going to make inflation worse or going to make inflation better? Yeah. So when you hear about policies to spend more, and both parties want to spend more on certain things.
Sure.
That by itself is inflationary. If you spend more and you don't raise any taxes to pay for the spending,
Right.
that's even more inflationary. Okay. Tax and spenders, when I was going to graduate school in the 70s, tax and spenders got a bad name.
Right.
You know, we got to get rid of the tax and spenders. That's a bad thing. Well, if you replace tax and spend by borrow and spend,
Yeah.
that's even worse.
Yeah.
So on a fiscal policy, if we're going to embark down a particular fiscal policy road, spending has to be balanced by increases in taxes somewhere, someplace, somehow.
Right.
But all I hear, frankly, in a lot of the political debate is, you get a tax cut, and you get a tax cut, and you get a tax cut. And then in the next breath, people say, oh, yeah, and I'm going to fix the debt problem.
Right.
And that just is arithmetically impossible. If everybody gets tax cuts
Yeah.
and we don't cut spending,
Right.
that's going to be a problem.
Yeah. Yeah. So
So the question, but see if I can follow this, because you talked about the state legislature as
Right.
well.
Right.
Okay. Where do they come in with respect to inflation?
yeah.
Well, part of our inflationary challenge is labor market driven.
Okay.
We've got a demographic problem in the country, Tom.
Yeah.
Folks like me are exiting. I'm a baby boomer. I'm headed out. I'm riding off into the sunset. I'm leaving the labor force. Tens of thousands like me are doing this
Yeah.
all the time. The labor force participation rate
Yeah.
from people of my cohort is just dropping like a rock.
Yeah.
It's actually immigrants,
Yeah.
both documented and undocumented, that are actually bolstering the labor force.
Yeah.
And so if we don't figure out a way to sustain a labor supply to provide services, to provide light manufacturing in the Midwest, to provide agriculture and dairy and food packaging services in the Midwest, and certainly construction. Construction's been huge in Arizona,
Right.
largely fueled by immigrants, both documented and undocumented.
Yeah.
That's a problem that needs to be addressed. We need to figure out our labor supply. And there's a lot of discussion. There's an initiative at play on immigration. There's a lot of discussion down at the legislature is that we have to, quote, fix our immigration problem.
Right.
But that means different things to different people.
Sure.
To some it means build the wall and deport them all.
Right. Right.
And to others it means, some type of change federally in work status, either term employment, expanding the visas. I mean, there's a number of ways to do it.
Yeah.
Pathways to citizenship or no.
Yeah.
But it's a very important problem, and it comes back to inflation. If we don't deal with labor supply efficiently, it's going to exacerbate inflation.
Because you'll have too much money chasing too few workers?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Professor Hoffman, for your time here today. And, you can check out this video and other videos with our subject matter experts on our website, azcleanelections.gov. And look forward to your ballots dropping on October 9th and Election Day on November 5th.